Hello and welcome to the Sidebar, presented by True Crime News, taking you inside the courtrooms of high-profile and notorious cases from across the country. I'm your host, Joshua Ritter. I'm a criminal defense lawyer based in Los Angeles and previously an LA County prosecutor for nearly a decade. You can find me on all social platforms at Joshua Ritter ESQ or at joshuaritter.com. In this week's episode, we're doing something a little bit different. We're taking a look at the University of Idaho murders after the surprising guilty plea of Bryan Kohberger. After more than 2 years of terror, questions, and legal proceedings, the murder of 4 college students has reached a bittersweet resolution with the guilty plea of Bryan Kohberger. While his true motives may never be known, his admission to the fatal stabbings will bring an end to the case that captures headlines and terrified parents across the country. Though Kohberger will spend the rest of his life behind bars, the plea will spare him the ultimate punishment of death. Before we get into the details of his sentence, let's discuss how we got here. Just before noon on November 13th, 2022, police received a call from a concerned housemate about a quote-unquote unconscious person in an off-campus home in the college town of Moscow, Idaho. While the details surrounding the initial response from authorities remain murky, the discovery in the home would haunt investigators and the public conscious for years to come. Inside the shared home, known for hosting parties and get-togethers, police found the slaughtered remains of 21-year-olds Madison Mogan and Kaylee Gonzalez, along with Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin, who were both just 20 years old. While the killer left behind a shocking and gruesome scene, no suspect was apparent, and no murder weapon was found. Immediately, the killings sent a shockwave through the local community, leading to a widespread panic. As speculation about the violent slaying ran rampant, detectives who hadn't worked a homicide in years struggled to keep their investigation under wraps as they pursued a suspect. However, each passing day and week only led to greater scrutiny and concern from the public. This was one of those cases where even if you do not follow true crime all that much, even if you don't follow the news all that much, I feel like you know where you were when you heard about these killings. It was so shocking and so nightmarish. I remember where I was. I remember when I heard about this. I remember seeing the photographs, seeing what we now know to be blood trickling down the outside wall inside of this home, where we're finding out that 4 college students had been stabbed at the time, what we believe to be while they slept in their beds. And it terrified everyone, obviously. And there's some very obvious reasons for that. These are the types of crimes that create nightmares for kids, not living high-risk lifestyles, not going out and involving themselves in any kind of criminal activity or putting themselves in harm's way, just living like college students. 4 young people with very bright futures ahead of them, living, that kind of carefree college life. And in the middle of the night, to have that stolen from them in the most brutal way and by a suspect that was at the time unknown. This is the kind of nightmares that parents have. The idea of sending your kids off to college and hoping they will be safe, hoping they don't come into harm's way, hoping that, they don't have their heart broken, hoping that they don't get bad grades, hoping that they don't have a bad college experience, but certainly hoping that something like this, maybe in the farthest reaches of the darkest part of your mind, you might fear, but hoping that nothing like this ever happens to them. This is the kind of stuff that I think resonates with all of us. And so because of that, it not only terrified that local community, it terrified the entire country. And then there was the immediate response from local law enforcement, which didn't seem to help. They did not seem up to task. They did not seem to coordinate and know how to respond to this. And much of that is really not their fault. They were not tasked with responding to something like this. They were not equipped to handle this type of a situation. This is a community where they don't see murders all that often, let alone these kind of middle of the night murders while people sleep, a quadruple homicide all taking place at once. This was something well above their heads, and that began to show. And their response was, I think, initially poor, and it lacked transparency, and it gave conflicting messages about the security of the community. At first, it was no one's in danger, and then it was there's still a suspect at large, and no one seemed to understand how exactly they should be responding to this, how afraid they should be, and that created more and more confusion and suspicion of whether or not the authorities were handling this properly. And then, as the days went on and even weeks went on and still no suspect was identified, they began to ask for help from the community, which seemed to further feed speculation and further feed into the idea that they didn't know what they were doing and they had no good leads, and the conspiracy theories started to develop. Nearly 2 months after the fatal stabbings, the hard work and determination of police, however, did finally pay off. The nationwide manhunt, which had been conducted in secrecy, finally produced an arrest in Pennsylvania. On December 30th of 2022, police announced the arrest of 28-year-old Bryan Kohberger, giving the first public look at the killer. The affidavit outlining Kohberger's arrest remains one of the most insightful documents surrounding the murders, offering an inside look at investigators' apprehension of the suspect. Police detailed the identification of Kohberger's vehicle, a light-colored Hyundai Elantra, which was seen leaving the scene in the early morning hours. Officers also detailed multiple trips by the vehicle in the vicinity of the home, noting Kohberger's likely planning of the killings. Eventually, police followed Kohberger's movements as the PhD student made a road trip with his father from Pullman, Washington, where he was attending school, across the country to his family home in Pennsylvania. After tracking the suspect across the United States, a clever bit of police work revealed the most damning evidence that would seal Kohberger's arrest. Using DNA found on a knife sheath left at Madison Mogen's bed, police created a profile that would prove to be the crux of the investigation. Using familial DNA obtained from the trash outside of the home of the Kohbergers, they were able to create a match consistent with the evidence found on the knife sheath. I firmly believe that without this DNA evidence, they may have eventually identified Kohberger as a potential suspect, but I don't think they ever would have arrived at enough evidence to actually bring charges against him. Much of the case, aside from that DNA, relies on eliminating how Bryan Kohberger's DNA could end up on that knife sheath. It relies on saying, what are the chances? What are the chances that a person whose DNA on that knife sheath would also not have an alibi, would also have a vehicle similar to the suspect vehicle, would also be able to be tracked through his cell phone and geolocation to being in the near that residence many times in the past, would also be able to identify that he had turned off his phone during the crucial time when they believe the murder took place, and on and on and on. And it all related back to that DNA evidence. Without that, I think we could firmly say he may not have ever been arrested for this case. And even the way that they were able to use that DNA, we're talking about touch DNA. DNA that is not from blood, not from saliva, not from a hair, but touching, literally skin cells flaking off when somebody touches an object. Probably the least firm, the least convincing, the least reliable type of DNA. Even though all DNA is very strong evidence, there's an argument to be made with touch DNA that it can be transferred. And then the way that they track this DNA back to him, they did not have a direct match for him. Like DNA, like fingerprints, are only as good as the match that you can make. And so when they entered this sample into their nationwide CODIS system, they got no hits. So again, now they're left with a situation where they don't know what to do with this crucial piece of evidence. And they were able to, through the FBI, enter that DNA into public genetic ancestry websites. And the argument was that the people on these websites were not aware that their information was being used in this type of way. Essentially, the FBI created a false profile through the suspect DNA and was able to match that to other people who had entered their DNA willfully, people who had entered their DNA trying to learn about their own ancestry, and were able to create a family tree of Bryan Kohberger and trace it back to their suspect. And then they go to Pennsylvania and are able to pull trash from his family home and match that not to Bryan Kohberger directly, but to who they could identify as the father of their suspect living in that home. And then what did we learn about Bryan Kohberger? Well, it only added to the myth and nightmare of this whole scenario. He was a person with no criminal record, a person who did not come from a background where we would expect this type of a monster to be created from. He came from a poor home, but there was no obvious signs of abuse, no troubled background that would explain this type of behavior or what would create this type of a person. He was a criminology student. He was going for his doctorate degree. He was highly educated, and he appeared to have no direct connections to any of the victims. There was no clear motive established once they realized who the suspect was, and to this day, no real clear motive as to why Bryan Kohberger targeted that home. But Kohberger's arrest would hardly bring finality to the case as the years-long legal saga began to unfold. While Kohberger had up to that point said nothing in court, a not guilty verdict was entered on his behalf, beginning a flurry of pretrial motions from both sides. However, as the years dragged on, little to no new information was released to the public, with a strict gag order on both sides. Just as it seemed the entire world would have to wait for the trial for the questions to be answered, Kohberger had a sudden change of heart. Whether it was his conscience catching up with him or perhaps the fear of facing death, Kohberger pled guilty to burglary and 4 counts of first-degree murder. While he has not provided a motive in the killings, he willingly admits to the intentional murders of the 4 victims. So a lot of questions have come out of this. In fact, sometimes more questions than answers. Why now? Why did his defense put up such a strong fight for so many months, filing nearly every conceivable motion in this case? I think a lot of that answer lies in the fact that the prosecution was pursuing the death penalty and that they viewed this as their crusade to save their client's life. So why now? Why now do they approach the prosecution with this idea of a potential plea? I think the timing of this is interesting. Though we have not heard his defense say this is what motivated them to begin discussions about a plea, I think it's safe to analyze what had taken place within days before us hearing about this plea having been entered into. And that was that his defense team lost what was possibly their last argument they could have made in court, their last of defense they could have launched in this trial. And that was the idea of an alternate suspect. In Idaho, you have to identify who you believe could have been an alternate perpetrator. Who else could have committed this crime? And you have to get permission from the court. You have to make an argument, identify who that person is, and show what connection there is between that person, beyond just speculation, suspicion, and conjecture, to the crime itself. Those arguments were made. They were made behind closed doors. The names of the individuals that they had identified, apparently 4 potential people, had been filed under seal. We'll never know who those people were, likely. And we'll never really know what the arguments were, but what we do know is that the judge denied these arguments. And so now they're left with nothing. And I imagine that was a conversation that his defense team had with him. You've got nothing. We're going into this case with no real defense. You will likely be convicted. And given the circumstances and the gruesome nature and loss of life in this case, very likely that you could see the death penalty. But I think it was still surprising to all of us because we had come so far, because we were so close to trial, and because, putting aside whatever feelings you may have politically or morally, religiously about the death penalty, if there is a death penalty in this country, then this certainly is the type of case and under the type of circumstances we would expect the prosecution to pursue the death penalty. And they did not here. Ultimately, they did pursue it. It was on the table, but ultimately they removed it in order to enter into a plea. And I think that shocked many of us who had been watching this case for a while. And we weren't the only ones who were shocked. The family members were shocked. Their reaction was, from some of them, very vocal. And even the judge himself said he didn't see this coming. But was this good for the prosecution at the end of the day? Many people feel that this was a sign of the prosecution rolling over, of the prosecution indicating some sort of weakness in their case. And I don't believe that any of that is really true. You have to look at this from the perspective of the prosecutors. The prosecutors represent the people of the state of Idaho. They don't necessarily represent the victims. They are not the victims' attorneys. The victims have their own attorneys. The victims' families have their own attorneys. They represent the people of Idaho and seeing that justice is done. Well, part of that calculation for the prosecution is no trial is a guarantee. No matter how good your evidence, no trial is a guarantee. You're putting the fate of a verdict in the hands of 12 people. And sometimes they make bizarre decisions. And sometimes things don't go as you planned. And sometimes a trial, even a well-planned trial, can go sideways. So no guilty verdict was guaranteed here. I think it was incredibly likely, but still not guaranteed. Then on top of that, even if you have a guilty verdict, no death penalty verdict is guaranteed. That same jury would have to sit and decide whether or not this man should see the death penalty. And they could have said no. We believe he committed the murders, but we also cannot agree on whether or not he should receive the greatest penalty that we have. And so you may have ended up in a place where we are right now, where he's convicted of the murders, but he's not going to see the death penalty. But there would be one crucial difference. Had he gone to trial, had he been convicted, and had they not found that he should receive the death penalty, he still would have maintained his rights to appeal. And we would have seen that for decades to come, him appealing everything that took place in this case, every decision made by the judge, everything that took place during trial. And we know how these appeals can sometimes go, that even decades later, sometimes defendants can get a lucky turn and have a lucky, kind set of justices sitting on an appellate court make a decision that's surprising to all of us. Now, with this plea, it's guaranteed that will never happen. It is guaranteed that he will go to prison for the rest of his life and never have a chance of appealing it. And so when you consider it, the math, as it were, from that perspective, it is a plea that you can understand why the prosecution can take. But one tremendous downside from all of this, yes, the families don't all agree with this, and yes, they feel hurt, and yes, they feel like justice hasn't been done. But I think why they feel that way more than anything else is the idea that we will never get answers. We will never get answers, perhaps, as to why he did this, why he targeted that house. And that, to me, is one of the things that the prosecution may have struggled with more than anything else. In exchange for his plea, Kohberger will avoid the death penalty. However, he will serve 4 life sentences plus an additional 10 years on the burglary charge, ensuring he will never see the outside of a prison cell again. Though additional information will likely be released after the gag order is lifted, there will be no explanation sufficient to account for the loss of 4 innocent lives. And at the end of the day, that's what this case has always been about. Justice for the slayings of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Gonzalez, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. We hope that this plea and sentence finally brings some peace to their families and to their loved ones. I will say I have had difficult conversations with family members as a prosecutor, and they never really go well. When you have lost a loved one, and the idea that a prosecutor is going to come to you and say that we want to enter into a plea, what they're saying is that we don't want to give this person, this defendant, who robbed you of your loved one forever, the maximum penalty. That's what a plea negotiation necessarily involves, is the defendant receiving something less than the maximum. And that is something that many victims' families simply cannot accept. And I completely understand that. And I completely give them room to feel that way. And the families in this case who feel very strongly that this was not justice, they should be respected in feeling that way. And they should be given the space to feel that way. And I encourage them to express themselves and grieve however they want in this case. And I will say that even had this case gone to trial, and even had he received the death penalty, I don't know if that would have been any more satisfying, because at the end of the day, those 4 beautiful young lives have still been lost, and these families will continue to grieve and try to heal, though they never will from this point on. That is our show for this week. We would like to thank our listeners and viewers for tuning into this very special episode of The Sidebar. I am, of course, your host, Joshua Ritter. You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Joshua Ritter ESQ. And if you want to hear my thoughts and coverage on even more true crime cases, you can also check out my new YouTube channel, Courtroom Confidential. And of course, you can find all of our Sidebar episodes wherever you get your podcasts, and we would love to hear from you. If you've got questions or comments you'd like us to address, please tweet us your questions with the hashtag TCN Sidebar. And thank you again for joining us at the True Crime News Sidebar.